turn to Matthew chapter 5. Look at one of my favorite passages of Scripture, the Sermon on the Mount tonight. It's like the longest recording of Jesus' teaching in the Gospels in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. That's what we call it, the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to be kind of jumping around a little bit. Right? You mind with this? No? I didn't get it. Okay. Can you hear me?
It's all.
Can you hear me? Is it all there? Sure. I think it's the same either way. There it goes. Oh, all right. All right, so Matthew chapter 5 is where we're going to be tonight. And really, I just want to give you an overview of the Sermon on the Mount. Right now in our teaching on Wednesday nights, we're going through the Sermon on the Mount. We started off with the Beatitudes and on to talk about salt and light. And as you can see, if you look through Matthew chapter 5, it's very well broken down. It's pretty easy for kids to understand and see. And so that's what we're doing. But I'm going to give you guys kind of an overview of the whole thing tonight, okay? And really to encourage you as a Christian about the Christian life, and if you're not a believer here tonight, to really show you what it means to be a Christian. When we look at the Sermon on the Mount, we have kind of an outline or kind of a blueprint of what a Christian or someone who follows after God is supposed to look like. This is what it means. This is what if you do these things, it means you look somewhat like a Christian, but we're going to find out that it's not quite that easy. In fact, Jesus opens up this sermon with a reminder of the Jewish people, or to the Jewish people, of what the law is for and what it means to be chosen by God, what it looks like to follow God, okay? But then he tells them immediately after that they've missed the point, okay? So they go through off the Beatitudes and through Scripture, beginning into the Sermon on the Mount in the first few verses, first 12 verses. And then he starts in verse 13. If you look in that, he says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet." He's talking about them. He's talking about how they were salt, but they've lost their taste. They're a city set on a hill, but they've chosen to keep their presence hidden. They have a light and the literal cure for darkness, but they've concealed it, okay? And he's showing these people, hey, you have the keys, you have the secrets to the kingdom of heaven. They've been given to you by the prophets. They've been given to you through the Word, the Old Testament. And you've chosen to conceal it. You've chosen to hide it away. You've taken the law, something that was meant to separate you, make your God attractive even, and you've added to it and made it a man-glorifying thing instead of a God-glorifying thing. And we know, how many of y'all, we've grown up hearing about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the scribes, and we know enough. If you hang around church long enough, and especially Southern Baptist churches, we know that being a Pharisee or being like a Pharisee is a negative thing, right? We don't want to be like the Pharisees. It seems like that was the biggest enemy to God or to Jesus, was the Pharisees. And in fact, these were the people who were supposed to have it all together during this time, during the first century. These are the people that if you were wondering about God and what it meant to follow after God, you would try to speak to a Pharisee. You would try to know and get to know a Pharisee and learn from them. But he's telling them, along with all the other Jews and disciples at this point, at the sermon, who are listening to him, that you're missing the point. You've become more man-glorifying or self-glorifying than God-glorifying. And we too can sometimes be in danger of being that way, can't we? If we really think about it, we can make this whole thing, this whole coming on Sundays and coming to this building and worshiping God, we can make this into something that looks like us instead of what God intended it to be, right? And we're in danger of that. And we try to combat that, we try to fight that, but instead, we tend to make it our own thing sometimes instead of following Jesus as a whole. And so we're tempted to kind of pine through the Bible or look through it and focus on things that we like. And we try to kind of perfect those things in our life. And we look at different denominations. Actually, you could see this if you study this in seminary. You see different denominations, and you see some that are over here and saying, well, we really worship really well. Okay, we've got the whole music thing down pat. We're not boring or something. We don't do this, or we're really gonna do really well in worshiping music wise. We're gonna slack off a little bit on preaching though. He can kind of be led a little bit more by the Spirit, and do what he wants to do. Or maybe someone might stray away a little bit from the Word. Have you ever been to a sermon that you thought, or a larger church, I'll say, and you will listen to a sermon, and it will be a good thing. It'll be biblical truth or something like that, but he'll never mention Jesus in the sermon. Y'all ever been to something like that? That's bad. That's wrong. That's against what the Bible is, right? That's not exactly biblical. And then sometimes somebody will come over here and they'll really hone in on the Word, and they'll almost be like, okay, guys, let's read the Sermon on the Mount. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom. And then let's go home. That's it, And then they do a little commentary on that. And worship is kind of dull. It's boring. It's not, and I'm not even talking about loud music or anything. I'm talking about, maybe some hymns that y'all like, some things that you enjoy and that you worship to. But we tend to put our personality into godly things sometimes, and that's not all the way bad, but. You see, the Pharisees did this, okay? They said stuff like, it says in the scriptures, in the Torah, that we shouldn't work on a Sunday. So we're going to take that to the extreme. In fact, we will even chastise someone if they spit on the ground on the Sunday, because technically that's watering the ground, and you're not supposed to be watering your crops on Sunday. In fact, you remember they even got onto Jesus for wanting to heal on the Sabbath. And when I say Sunday, I mean Sabbath. They wanted to heal on the Sabbath, right? That's crazy. Jesus says, who of you who doesn't, if a sheep falls in a hole, doesn't go get it out of the hole on the Sabbath? Of course you do, right? It's not work. You're missing the point, right? What is that point? And he talks about that point in the Sermon on the Mount. Let me direct your attention to the main passage we'll focus on tonight, and that's Matthew 5:17 through 20. Does somebody, we'll be a little informal tonight, does somebody want to grab that and read that to us? Matthew 5:17 through 20. Who's going to volunteer? Okay, Miss Peggy, go ahead and stand up and make your voice known. So.
Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly, I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. Whosoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so, shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven.
Okay, thank you, Miss Peggy. So, verse 20 especially, for I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. The law was meant to point us to our need for Jesus. Okay? The law has always meant to point us to our need for Jesus. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, think about who Jesus is speaking to. Who's he speaking to now in this passage? Just anybody? Who's he speaking to? Disciples, that's right. Disciples, we know that for sure, but there could have been a crowd around us at this time. And, I mean, most likely he's preaching on a mount, so surely he's up high, kind of speaking down to folks. And so his disciples are close to him. So he's speaking to them first, but Jews are overhearing him. And the disciples were Jews as well. And they would have heard that statement. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And they would have done this. Oh man, what? I can't exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. Those are the most righteous people at the time. What do you mean, Jesus? Do you mean I have to go even further than the burden that these Pharisees are putting on me? It's very difficult, and that would be a very let down statement, but that's not the end of the sermon as we know it, right? And I just want to just kind of make this real for us. I want you to name a Christian teaching that maybe you grew up with that was different from like a friend at school or someone who wasn't a believer. Maybe just tell me anything. Any kind of Christian teaching you grew up with that made you different. So,
women not supposed to wear pants.
Okay, so like maybe more modesty then for women, or even...
Big Pentecostal following, at least, and lesson.
Okay, yeah, so it made you a little different, right? Made you a little different. What else? That's a good example. What else? Language, okay, yeah. You don't curse, right? Like many of our friends do. What else? Let's get a couple more.
Some of my Church of Christ friends did not allow music in their church, and we had music in our church.
Right, a little different there. So, I'm sorry, my dad is calling me. No doubt it's my dad. He loves to call me at the most inopportune times. So, it's just buzzed in my pocket. So, yeah, that's one. What about coming to church on Sunday, right? Did y'all ever grow up with any friends that didn't go to church on Sunday? That just had another day or whatever? It's a little different, okay?
I never got to watch the Disney movies because they came on at 6 o'clock on Sunday night.
The Disney movies. That's sad. During prayer meeting, probably intentionally, huh? Yeah, I mean, Jesus goes through basically these lists of things that are just like what you guys are saying, and actually a little deeper for us as well. But these things that makes you look different than the people around you, makes you look different than the world around you. He goes through this list and he says, "You've heard it been taught to you this way before, but now I'm telling you." Look at that, verse 21. And on your anger, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment." Go on to verse 27. "You've heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman or man with lustful intent has already committed adultery with them in his heart," or in her heart, right? Go down to oaths in verse 33. He says, "Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn.'" Look at verse 37. "Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one," right? So he goes to this list and he says, this is supposed to be what separates you, right? And unless your righteousness exceeds that, he kind of gives us a picture of what righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees looks like. And still, I think for just a moment, and even us now, we look at this and we hear this and we say, man, I have not lived up to that expectation, right? How many of you have ever made a promise or an oath before in this room? Okay, bunch of liars. How many of you have ever been angry with someone, right? Everyone, right? In fact, I love that Jesus started off with that, because that's a sin that every single person that heard it would have recognized and said, "Oh man, I've been angry." And he counts the same, that is the same as murder. And we can think about that, right? We've not ever hurt anybody, but we've been so angry to the point of them wanting to go away, or us wanting to hurt them, right? And I could just see the crowd of disciples looking at Jesus thinking, it's clear that he has authority, but this is impossible. And Jesus was showing them what a righteousness that exceeds the Pharisees looks like. It's a righteousness that penetrates us as deep as our thought life, even changing our very souls. And the second important thing I want you to understand, I'm leading you to a point here, so just keep following along. Following Jesus makes obedience possible, okay? Following Jesus makes obedience possible. So the first thing we understand is the law, or the need to obey the law, is meant to point us to our need for Jesus. The second thing about the Sermon on the Mount that I want you to understand is that following Jesus makes obedience possible. Immediately after hearing the words in verse 20, Jesus identifies a sin that every person would have committed. We just spoke about that, anger. And I think the disciples said, well, great, I can't do that. So what's the point? Why would Jesus lay out this kind of buffet of sins that people thought they weren't committing, and then pull the rug out and say, no, you don't have a righteousness that is worthy of God? In fact, you think that you've been obeying God this whole time, but in reality, you've been disobeying Him in your mind, in your heart. You really just are going through the motions. I mean, we hear this all the time, don't we? How many of you guys have ever talked to a person about Jesus and they say, I think I'm a pretty good person. I haven't never killed anyone, or I've been faithful to my husband, whatever. Well, have you heard that before? You ever heard that before? And what's the problem with that? What's the problem with that? Y'all can answer that. What's the problem with we want to kind of say, well, that's great. You never hurt anybody. You've always been faithful.
Pretty good.
It's pretty good, but it's not good enough. That's right. It's not good enough. Number 3, obeying Jesus means placing complete faith in him. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me stop. He said, what's wrong with that picture? He says they think that they have a righteousness worthy enough for God's presence, right? You talk to somebody like that and they say, hey, I've done pretty good in my life. I think that I haven't hurt anybody. Why wouldn't God let me into heaven? Why wouldn't God let me into his presence? And the reason of that is exactly, you're not good enough. According to this standard, your righteousness has to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. Your righteousness has to exceed that of the preachers. Your righteousness, guys, girls, ladies, gentlemen, has to exceed that of Billy Graham's. All right, for you to get into heaven. It has to exceed that of whoever you think is the ultimate good that we can understand under Christ. Your righteousness has to exceed that to be in his presence. And it makes us shake our head because we don't have that kind of righteousness. I don't, at least. Jesus internalizes it. He says, oh, you haven't killed, but you've hated, you've lied so much that you've created this oath system to validate your words. And Jesus eventually tells them the consequence of this type of thinking. Look at Matthew chapter 7. Going towards the end of the Sermon on the Mount. This is the consequence of this kind of thinking. Look at chapter 7, verse 21. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then will I declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Is that me? Do you read that passage and think that? Is that me? Look in verse 24. And he sums up the Sermon on the Mount in this. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been found on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat against that house and it fell. And great was the fall of it. So here's the question. How do I build this house, this Christian walk, my life? How do I build this house on the rock? You need the rock. That's the answer. You need the rock. Jesus is the rock that you build your house upon. You build your life upon the rock, and that's Jesus Christ. Building it upon works-based salvation, that's the sand. It doesn't work. You can't be good enough, right? So finally, now point 3, obeying Jesus means placing complete faith in him. We must bow down before Jesus and admit our dependence on him. He's the rock. Jesus came and he died for this very reason, right? Specifically, he knew that we could not reach perfection. He knew that he would have to do something to bring us back to him. This could only be done through his sacrifice, his death, and his resurrection. This act wasn't meant to help us be better people, to help us work out our own, or work to gain God's favor. No, this is the work, and it is finished, right? I'll read that one more time for you guys. This act, Jesus' sacrifice, his death, his resurrection, wasn't meant to help us be better people, okay? It's to help or to even gain some type of favor before God in ourselves. No, this is the work and it is finished. Our only choice in the matter is to recognize who Jesus is and worship him. That's it. That's it. And that's what's so good about this, because Jesus lays out this whole kind of these buffet of sins, these things that every person in that audience would have recognized. In fact, if you read through the Sermon on the Mount, I guarantee you there's at least one thing he talks about that you say, yeah, I fall short. I fall short there. I fall short. I think about that. I'm angry with my brother. I lie all the time. I don't give. In fact, I pick and choose things out of the Bible. And if you don't think you do that, how many of you guys have fasted lately? Yeah, we do that, okay? We look at things in the Bible and we say, that's pretty good, that's pretty easy, I can do that. This whole fasting thing, maybe like once a year, maybe, when I'm trying to slim down or something, right? We don't do that. And so my concern for you is to not for you to start fasting. I think you should, but that's not what this sermon specifically is about, is to realize that you are not good enough and you cannot be good enough. Only through Jesus are we made right in God's sight. Our only choice in the matter is to recognize who Jesus is and worship him. And once we recognize who Jesus is, that he is God and we are not, and we worship him, then we begin to find that we have this desire that's coming from the inside out to perform these things on the Sermon on the Mount. All of a sudden, when we think lustfully or something, there's this little trigger called the Holy Spirit that says, hey, don't do that. You're new creation. When we think about anger or lying or something like that, we have this pool in us that says, hey, something we did not have before that says, hey, you're called to a better standing. You're called to something different. So our response, once again, our only choice in the matter is to recognize who Jesus is and worship him. And Jesus gives an example of just that, of what it looks like to worship him. Look in chapter 8, and I love this. I hope that you read through the Bible, kind of, that you don't just open it up and say, I'll read that today, but you actually read through books of the Bible, because when you do that, you see it run together, and you see so many good teachings come out of that. Look at chapter 8. The sermon's over, but the story's not. Chapter 8, verse 1. When he came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. And behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will be clean. So how do you receive a righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees? You pray to the Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. I'm tired. I can't be good enough for you. I need you. I need your righteousness. And what is Jesus' response? I will be clean. And because he's God, because he's the resurrected Savior, he could say something like that statement and it actually happened. And that's where your faith comes in. You actually believe that, hey, when he says, I will be clean, I'm clean. I'm clean before a holy God. So tonight, if y'all don't mind playing the Potter's Hands thing again. Is that the name of the song? I don't know if this song's so. Tonight, I want you guys to go ahead and stand up, okay? We have a different type of invitation, okay? If you're not a Christian tonight, this is an opportunity for you to be a Christian. And I would say I would love to come down. You could come down and talk to me, or if you want to, maybe you're struggling with that right now with you and the Lord. If you want to just say a prayer at your seat, that's fine. I would like for you to come tell me afterwards, but that's okay. But for most of us tonight, if you're a Christian, I want you to think about that. I want you to think if, you need your mic, don't you? So if you're a Christian, I want you to think about if you have been trying to earn God's favor in a way that kind of glorifies yourself. Maybe you've had an opinion about yourself or an opinion about anything, and it might be a good biblical opinion, but you've almost been explaining that in a way that glorifies you instead of God. I just want you to close your eyes right now, and I want you to confess that to God. And I want you to just speak to him and just ask if Lord, if you see any spot in me that's not clean, will you make it clean? And if you're a believer in him, he'll do it. Just take a moment and do that.